Do you remember when Nintendo first showed The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild over 2 years ago at the 2014 Game Awards? You know, back when it was known just as Zelda Wii U? And even though the developers of the game showed off on a small TV from like 90 feet away, it was still super exciting seeing Zelda Wii U being played for the first time. There was so much mystery back then, like what other secrets or surprises might be lurking just off camera. So, now that Zelda Wii U, or Breath of the Wild, is here at last, we're finally able to explore that world for ourselves. And it got us thinking, can we actually find some of those same locations shown over 2 years ago? And if so, how have they changed since then? Now, in a world as big as this one, finding some of those locations might seem to be impossible, especially since they might look dramatically different now. However, Nintendo actually revealed what the world map looked like at the time, and as it turns out, it's remarkably faithful to the final game. You can already see how most of the major landmarks and landforms match up. We can see what ended up being Central Hyrule right in the middle, Lake Hylia just to the south, and same for Death Mountain to the northeast. Even the world's borders are extremely similar, with Ocean to the east, a deep ravine that wraps around the northwest corner, and the flat desert to the southwest. Now granted, it's not an exact match, as some things like trails and rivers have either been rerouted or were missing entirely originally. But on the whole, it's impressive how similar the two maps really are, even though they're years apart. Which is a very good thing for us, as that old map also revealed Link's exact location in the first scene. So what do you say we venture on over to that area in Breath of the Wild and see how things look nowadays? And here we are, even at the same time of day, and it looks remarkably similar, while being remarkably different. It's a little bit like one of those optical illusions, where depending on how you look at the picture, you can either see a young woman or an old one. Except in this case, it's either an identical landscape or a completely different one. And the reason for that is most of the major landmarks are in roughly the same place, but it's in the finer details where things start to look a bit different. The waterfall on the right is still there, but now it's a bit wider, and the mountain it's falling from is now a bit taller. In fact, most of the mountains and landmasses in general have either been noticeably resized or reshaped, including the very cliff we're on right now. Yeah, I actually have a bit of a confession, because I may have led you to believe that this is the exact same cliff edge from the original footage. Except that's not exactly the case, because that original cliff no longer exists. And we know that because we went to that exact spot that Link's standing in the Game Awards footage, which, going by the map, is butting up right against the right side of the U-shaped trail here. And look where that puts us. Right next to the trail, at ground level. Yeah, it's a far cry from the high ledge that they were originally on. Which means we had to approximate a similar viewpoint for the mountain behind us. A mountain which, by the way, seems to have been smoothed out to a more gradual slope compared to before, which explains a missing cliff. You can see on the map just how much farther back we had to go in order to get a similar perspective. But even with all the differences, it's pretty wild how identifiable this area still is. And that's where the fun comes in, because we can finally reveal what's remained a mystery all this time, being what else is around here. So let's see what happens if we point the camera just eastward a little bit. Whoa, there's Hateno Village. Huh, who would have guessed that there's an entire suburb just out of frame in the original Game Awards footage? Although, believe it or not, there was actually a hint of this village back then too. And not just because of the building icon on the map, but also because at the very start of the original video, we can see two plots of dirt separated by a tree. And if we go to that same spot in Breath of the Wild, well, there are two similar looking dirt plots separated by a similar looking tree. But once again, there are almost as many differences as there are similarities, such as how the flagpoles that used to mark the path leading up to the village have now gone missing. At any rate, since this is the exact spot where Link started from in the Game Awards footage, you might be wondering, hey, what happens if we try to follow the path up to the cliff ledge that we said no longer exists? Well, as you can see in this side-by-side, we quickly ran out of room to move, whereas the Link in the Game Awards footage is able to continue out onto the ledge that hangs over the path. And as a result of that missing cliff, the wooden platform that was there was lost in the process too. In its place is just this lousy flagpole set even farther back. And there's another major difference around here too, because the region's tower not only looks dramatically different, but it's even been relocated entirely. Originally, it was positioned on the edge of the hill just ahead, whereas in Breath of the Wild, it's been moved onto an entirely new landmass slightly to the west. So there it is. And here is where it was supposed to go. And speaking of that tower, let's check it out from a slightly different vantage point in Breath of the Wild, in an area that you might also recognize from the Game Awards footage. Or maybe not, because again, the tower wasn't located here back then. In either case, this is in fact the same trail where Link first met Epona in the Game Awards footage. And like before, it's recognizable, but different. There's still a forest at the top, and the grander details of the valley below still seem to match up, like the rocky structure and the ruins. But on the other hand, the trail here used to be thinner with a rockier look, and the bordering mountain used to be steeper and, well, uglier. Oh, and there used to be a random torch here too. Now, I don't know about you, but at the time I imagined that this scene took place at least some distance away from the first one. But as it turns out, it's actually super close. In fact, we'll show you how close in Breath of the Wild as we head forward right from the cliff in the first scene. Look, we're here already! And as you might have noticed, this means that the forest that the developers were looking at from the cliff is the exact same one just past Epona, which we now know is called Jinner Woods. So as it turns out, when the developers leapt off the cliff and began parasailing, using the sailcloth no less, they were heading right toward their next location. Who knew that was a clue all along? Anyways, if you want to check out this area for yourself, you'll find it right here on the map. Now a bit later on in the Game Awards footage, Nintendo showed off several scenes that take place in a heavily forested area. And as you probably know by now, there are a lot of forests in Zelda Breath of the Wild, which means tracking down where these scenes take place might be a little bit tricky, and that's assuming they even all take place in the same general location. But thankfully they do, and it's the final scene from the Game Awards footage that helped us tie it all together. Because as we pointed out even back then, the Great Bridge of Hylia can be seen in the background, as well as the region's tower on the hill just left of it. And as it turns out, both of those are in the exact same place in Breath of the Wild, which puts Link right about here on the map, within the Faron Woods. So from here, we were able to work backwards to figure out where the other forest scenes take place too, because the very start of that bridge scene begins with these two stone pillars, which are both heavily featured in the original gameplay, with Link fighting off some bokoblins from horseback. And sure enough, we found two very similar looking pillars in that same spot in Breath of the Wild, which you can find for yourself right here on the map. Although, we say similar looking because the pillars themselves are now a bit more straight edged. And then there's the fact that the one on the left has taken some serious damage. Yeah, the last 2 years really haven't been that kind to it. And then we have this scene, which unfortunately features exactly 0 landmarks from the other clips. I mean, it's pretty much just trees. Except for this rock with some strangely distinctive markings. And as it just so happens, we accidentally stumbled upon that exact same rock just south of the pillars, right here on the Breath of the Wild map. So we only had to work our way backwards from there to find the very start of that clip, next to the same pond and identically placed trees nearby, even if those trees do look slightly different. But otherwise, the forest really hasn't changed all that much since then, although some of the rock work along the trail has been swapped out for man-made objects, like pillars or the staircase here. And that's for a good reason, as it better ties into the pair of pillars just ahead, as well as the general ruins theme in this region. And speaking of which, we can see some more ruins have been added to the right side of the pillars, and then there's a new large boulder just in front of the left pillar. Oh, and the enemies that used to be found around here are now completely missing. At any rate, we get another look at those pillars in this scene, with Link riding toward them from the opposite side. But if we back it up, we can see that the area north of the pillars is now much more heavily forested. Originally, we could see the pillars from all the way back here, whereas now they're completely obscured by the trees. And we get a better look at that in this next scene, with Link riding past the pillars in the opposite direction, toward the Great Bridge of Hylia to the north. The path leading to it used to be entirely clear, but now you can barely see the path, let alone where you're going. But once we get back out in the open, the area suddenly becomes a lot more recognizable. The bridge more or less looks the same, and that goes for the two large rocks here too. Although once again, we can see how much the ground and mountain textures have changed since 2 years ago. Okay, now as Link circles the rocks, we can see the view of Death Mountain has been slightly obscured by a new hill just ahead. In fact, the entire area here now is a lot more uneven and full of hazards, whereas it used to be a mostly open field. Alright, so that pretty much covers it for the forest, except for one thing. Because now that we know the geographical locations of each scene, we realize that the order they presented them at the Game Awards doesn't make any sense. So stick with me here, because the first forest scene is of Link approaching the two pillars from the north, but the next scene then shows Link heading toward the rock with distinctive markings to the south. And since he's heading north, that means he's going toward the pillars once again. So that's kind of weird. This stood out to us because it means the developers originally rode past the twin pillars, then past the rock, before turning around and heading back past the rock, then past the pillars, at which point they finally decided to start riding toward the Great Bridge of Hylia. So basically, it seems like the developers just rode back and forth along this forest for pretty much the entire second half of the video, which is a little odd in hindsight. And it gets weirder, because as you might recall, the entire point of this journey was to reach the tower that the developers had marked on their map. That's why they grabbed Epona in the first place, to get to the tower even faster. And since we now know that Epona was found right here, we can see that they were already relatively close. And yet, they somehow ended up in the Faron Woods all the way to the south. They're way off course! But the developers don't act like it at all, saying that it'll only take about 4 to 5 minutes from here. So yeah, nothing's adding up here. But hey, who knows, maybe some context was lost in the editing or something. Although, for the record, it took us slightly over 6 minutes to get to where the tower was originally supposed to be located while on horseback. Anyways, we're getting way off track. Zelda developer style. Unfortunately, this might be the end of the road for us, because there's still one scene from the Game Awards footage that we couldn't place at all, being this one of Link riding between various fields and forests. So if you have any idea where this is, let us know by posting in the comments below, and we may follow up in a future video. But to make up for it, we have one more scene for you, but this time it's from a year later, being the entire trailer from the November 2015 Nintendo Direct. Yep, all 10 seconds of it, which we infamously analyzed the grass in for like 10 minutes. Which, by the way, looking back, we totally nailed it. So here's that same area in Breath of the Wild. And as you might have guessed, it's both very similar and yet different, even though it is a year newer than the Game Awards footage. For instance, the hill just behind Link here is pretty much identical, and the same goes for the swampy forest down here too. But on the other hand, the view of Death Mountain is now a bit more obscured, and the area to the left has seen some dramatic changes, like the addition of a giant ribcage. So if you want to check out this area for yourself, just head right here on the map. And there you have it. You now know how to find almost every area in Zelda Breath of the Wild from back when the game was known just as Zelda Wii U. And it's surprisingly fun to look at the old footage and then see what else is around there in the final game. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe for more on Zelda Breath of the Wild and everything else Nintendo Switch 2.